Hi, this is Jason Lisk with Pool Genius, here with episode 2 of Pool Picks Playbook by Pool Genius. In this episode, I'm going to dive into a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and also one that probably is going to maybe expose a little too much of this thing up here, and it can be scary. We're going to get into survivor pick in-game strategy. That is, when we get toward the end of a survivor pool, how we want to think about playing it out. And quite frankly, like I said, we're going to dive deep. So if you're just a pick the picks guy, and we'll get into that, this episode's probably going to be a little in depth for you, but we're going to go deep into how to think about it. So what is in-game strategy? In-game strategy for survivor pools refers to the strategy you need to consider to win your specific pool going against the opponents you're facing. So you really need to think about, there's a phrase, what got you there what got you here won't get you there. Sometimes playing a survivor pool, the strategy to get to the end may be different than how you want to play out the end. Sometimes it's like, I like to draw a lot of analogies to poker, and there's a difference between being in a large field and playing a poker event and then being at the final table, right? Or being heads up and how you're going to play it. So we're going to delve into some of that strategy. So let's get in to survivor pool in-game and what it is. In survivor pool in-game strategy, one of the things you're going to want to do is look at how many people are left. Survivor pool in-game is when you are down toward the end with a realistic chance to win. Everybody's interpretation of what realistic chance is, but if you play in a lot of pools and there's several hundred people in them, if you go in with the right mindset, you're really like less than 1% in a lot of cases to win. You're an extreme long shot to win any particular entry. For me, when that entry gets to about 10%, either because there's that few entries left or because the teams my entry has left to pick out might have a 10% chance of making it to the end or more, then I would start to think of myself as being in the end game and adjust how I'm going to play that pool. The number of entries by your opponents is small enough that you can study them each individually. That's another key factor. That number again is going to be different for all of you. Some of us might be sick enough to study 20 or more entries. Some may only want to do 5. I'm going to use an example today where I'm talking about 11, and I think that's reasonable for me. But, when can you study your opponent entries and try to put them on picks? The other factor is it's late enough. Contests could end in the next 4 to 5 weeks based on who's left, the type of matchups, and what people have used. Or the end of season is so close that the contest is going to end in the next month. So that's another factor. And then when you can study your opponent picks and tendencies, and those can help you identify key strategies specific to your pool, is another important factor to know you're in the end game. Because when you get down to the end, you will have different variations in your pool than say a different pool just naturally. Public pick popularity data is pretty good at a broad scale and in identifying how people will pick in large groups. But if there's only 10 entries left, people may in that particular pool have used a certain team heavily in 1 week. And those are the entries that happen to get through. And that may not be the case in different pools. So you're going to want to look at what specifically has happened in your pool, how people who have made it to the end have picked, and things like that. So, as we get ready to dive into it, I do want to acknowledge, there's different viewpoints on this. I saw a X post. I guess that's what we're calling it nowadays. I'm so old that it'll always be Twitter to me. But I saw a post by Chris R. Farley, not in a van down by the river, I don't believe. But Chris R. Farley said, if you're still in NFL Survivor, contrary to what anyone else says, your job is not to give a shit about any other entry. It is the most common mental mistake. Just win, just make it to the end. Well, obviously, a lot of what I'm going to go through today is going to be considered a mental mistake by Chris Farley. I do want to acknowledge, though, some things, because we're not in complete disagreement. Obviously, picking winners is the ultimate goal of Survivor, right? And so you don't want to get so crazy in the end game that you're taking so many risks that you're not putting yourself in the best position to pick winners. But the goal with the strategies that I'm going to talk about is to set yourself up to win by identifying where you can win the pool sooner, where you can create key points, and where you can make decisions that help you. And I'll give you an example from last year in a splash pool I did. It was a small $2 entry pool. I wrote about it on the site. There's a video. How I turned that $2 entry into a $3,000 win, solo win in that pool, a multi-pick pool late in the year. If I were to just, quote, pick winners and go by my thoughts, because I guess my viewpoint is I'm not perfect. I'm never going to get all the games perfect. I'm going to be wrong, and the market's going to be wrong because there's just natural variation in NFL and in sports. If I were to have picked just who I thought would win last year in that pool, week 17, if you recall, the Giants have been terrible. The Colts went into New York, and the Colts were the team that was available to everybody. There were 5 people left in the pool. We had to make 2 picks. Earlier in that pool, I had thought about how others might pick, and I actually saved Tampa Bay. So I had Tampa. I was the only entry that had them entering week 17 in this pool. I still had the Rams, I still had the Chargers, and I had the Colts, but everybody had the Colts. And if I were just picking on win odds by the market, or I was just picking on who I thought was the winner, I would have included the Colts in my 2-game picks that week. And if they would have won, I would have advanced with everybody else to week 18, and I probably would have split, and that $3,000 would have been a $600 maybe win if it ended up in a 5-way split. I thought everybody was going to be on the Colts. I could have saved Tampa for 18, but I made the decision to go against. That was what I thought was a key leverage spot in a multi-pick pool where I would catch everybody on one team, and you never know what happens. And what did happen is the Colts lost, and that decision won me 5x what just simply not paying attention to how I thought others might play it would do. So just one of those decisions can get you a 5x, an 8x, a 10x type of payoff and be worth it if you set it up, and be worth the time you spend on the ones you lose, because you will lose because no pick is perfect. So let's get in to the in-game strategy. But before we do that, I do want to quickly say, if you enjoy this series, and if you want more content like this, where we talk about pools and strategy, hit that like and subscribe button. And in the comments, in this Pool Picks Playbook series, we are going to go into a variety of sports, not just Survivor pools, not just football pools. We will cover a lot of things. I got a lot of things on tap for the next couple months, but put in pools you would like to see covered from a strategy perspective. With that, let's get to it. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this is to talk about our Survivor Bowl 1, a contest that we are hosting. We have a lot of people in the football content space, media, betting, fantasy football, media personalities from outside football who were in this contest. We're down to 11 entries after 11 weeks. In the Survivor Bowl, the winners are playing for $10,000 to themselves and $5,000 to the charity of their choice. So now each entry has an implied total value they're going to win for themselves and charity of over $1,000. And we're going to talk about these 11. So even though I'm breaking down this specific contest, I just want to use it as an illustration. So you can watch this video, even if you watch this video after the NFL season is over, you'll be able to glean a lot of key strategy points by using this in this example of how I would think about a contest that is in action right now, and is what I would consider down to the end game with 11 entries remaining and 6-7 picks remaining, because it's single pick for weeks 12 through 18. So let's talk about using Survivor Bowl to examine your opponent entries. I'm going to show you some of the things I do. This is where I talk about maybe delving into some sicko behavior, but we're going to study how our opponents pick. So what I did here is I actually looked at their picks over the first 11 weeks. I didn't use the contest popularity because you wouldn't know that if you were a person entering picks. I looked at public popularity data and win odds data, and I kind of ranked the 11 surviving entries by how much they tended to lean toward the popular pick in a given week and how much they tended to lean toward the highest ranked win odds pick in a given week. And I kind of ranked these contestants by that method. So I'm looking at both, and this is kind of a descending order from what I would say is the most conservative. Tended to go with the more popular picks, higher win odds picks versus those who were a little more, taking some shots on some riskier picks, some picks that others weren't on. So as we can see, Sean Foreman, who runs all the sports reference sites, by the way. So if you're a Pro Football Reference, Baseball Reference, that's Sean Foreman. And Sean Farnham of ESPN college basketball coverage. Very similar names. We're just a few letters off, but at polar opposites in this contest. Sean Foreman ranks at the top with Nick Whalen in terms of how he tends to go with teams that are toward the top in popularity and toward the top of win odds to this point. Sean Farnham and Patrick Doherty, Roto Pat, are down there at the bottom, along with Jay Kornegay, meaning they tended to take teams that were a little more contrarian. And so as a result, they have entries that don't look exactly like the others to this point. We'll get into some of that in the future. But for now, what I wanted to illustrate is I actually went through this exercise because it allowed me to rank these players. Like if I were sitting in a poker room, I would want to know kind of how people play, right? I want to try to get a read on them. And up until now, we've been playing in a big contest. And so if I were in endgame and money is on the line and I want to give myself the best edge, I want to know which players I can tend to put on certain types of picks and who is a little more unpredictable for me as I try to map out picks. And we're going to get into that here in a minute on mapping out your picks. But that's this list, and I'm going to use that then to dive in to the next strategy. So now we're going to talk about projecting the value of your opponent entries and kind of working on assessing it. And I think we have some great tools at Pool Genius. So I'm going to show you some of that and how you can incorporate these tools into your own in-game process if you choose to dive as in depth as I do. So I'm going to pull up here an entry. This I've loaded in here. This is one of the entries from Survivor Bowl, and I put in the 11 picks. This is from Dan back of Roto Grinders, and his entry here, and I'm going to run the optimal path on it. We have an optimal path tool. You can load your entries if you've been tracking them throughout the year with us, and it'll show you future weeks. So this pool has one pick due per week after this, and it's going to generate an optimal path for both survival and EV, and we can look at that, right? And so here's what the optimal path shows for this particular entry. And it also shows you estimated survival odds. I've actually pulled these survival odds in both the max survival and the max EV paths. And you can also look at alternate versions and see where there are changes. For example, on this entry, it shows San Francisco. It also shows Las Vegas as an option and a Las Vegas in the EV paths. So that tells me that at least if this person, was playing optimally, they might be looking at these two teams. They don't have Detroit. They don't have Seattle, and they do not have Baltimore available on this particular entry for week 12 of the three favorites of double digits. So they're going to have to get a little more creative. And the most likely teams that make sense for their entry as a whole are to either go with San Francisco or Las Vegas. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. But I also want to dive into a bit of a topic that I know comes up when we're talking in game, which is how long should I plan for my pool to last? Because do I need to plan for it to go to week 18 or not? And my answer to that would be, I would try to figure out where I realistically think it won't end, right? Like in this contest with 11 and looking how people have picked and the odds for this week. I mean, I think it's very unlikely this contest ends in week 12 or week 13. I think there'll be enough spread out. It could, but those are unlikely scenarios. It would take a lot of big upsets. But by the time you get to like week 15, it's certainly in play that this could be down to a couple entries, or it could be over if there's a big wipeout. So I'm kind of looking all along the spectrum, right? I don't want to save a team for week 17 if I think they're equally great as a pick right now. But if I think the pool's getting to 17, or at least there's an above average chance, and I think it's a significantly better pick, then I may choose that. So that's not really a simple answer, but I'm kind of evaluating the entire spectrum. And I'm going to show you how to use this tool to kind of do that as well. So the good thing, one of the many things about this optimal path tool, and I'm going to show you, these are little tricks of the trade that I have that I like to employ. So it's set up and it's going to generate your optimal path through all the remaining pick weeks, right? But what if I only want to see what's my optimal path to get through week 16 if I need to? I'll worry about 17, 18 when I get there. Well, I'm actually going to load in some bad teams that I would never consider picking in those final two slots. Sorry, Giants fans, I'm not picking you. And I'm going to run the optimal path, and then I'm just going to look at the results through week 17 down below. It has a lot of the same this week. We see San Francisco, Las Vegas still showing up. Houston, Philly, and 16. The odds to survive just to 16 for this entry, 28% at max odds of survival, 17% at max EV. But again, for those that aren't familiar, the difference between those max survival and max EV paths are, we're not caring about popularity. This is the pick the winners. Don't care how many people join me. Those are all popular options. If this entry gets to week 16 using those, a lot of other picks are still alive as well. So you're having to hit a longer, more multi-leg parlay by picking the popular route, if that makes sense. So that's a trick that I use to evaluate these entries. Is I'll actually lock in some picks and kind of consider those as up. Now I want to see what it takes to get to 16. Now I want to see what it says I should do if my goal is just to maximize to 14. And that's a way you can kind of like jot down what it's telling you, but you can also note what it's telling you about your opponent entries. Because here, let's pretend like I'm an omniscient 12th observer, 12th player in this pool trying to figure out how to play. I'm walking through how I would evaluate the 11 entries. I would do this with all of them. And I have, by the way, for this video. I've gone through and I've run optimal paths because I think our product's pretty good. I think it does a good job of figuring out the win odds and popularity of these teams. Obviously, things could and can change, but in general, it's going to be pretty good overall. And so I think it gives me an indication of how other people might think as well. And so I'm using it as kind of like a scouting guide. Where can I put people on picks? So I do that for all of the entries. And I did that here just to walk you through what this graphic is showing you. This is showing you my calculation using the optimal path EV, max EV outputs to maximize through these certain weeks for each entry. You can see that there are differences in these entries in their value, and the value at the end is me basically taking like the chances this team can get through by playing like an EV type play, right? Because yeah, their odds might be a little better in survival, but their pot share probably doesn't grow. And so I'm looking at the max EV in this contest numbers to kind of assess how strong these entries are. And so I've created this to basically walk down and show you and show me which entries are most valuable. You can do this in your pool when you're down to 5, whatever you want to do. I've basically used it to create a value and expectations chart for all of these entries. Is this excessive? I mean, here's what it tells me. Like, I can identify which entries are worth the most. If I were one of these players, I could identify, which entries probably have me beat on average on equity, and who am I better than, where I might want to make different decisions. And so here's how it comes up. Here's how it really comes up in when you're thinking about endgame strategy. If I know there's an entry stronger than me in certain areas, like they're gonna have me in week 15, right? That'll help me make certain decisions, like do I make a similar pick to them up to that point if they're better than me, or do I try to be unique from them, hoping that entry gets knocked out on a pick I'm not on, and I try to stay off of them and then their path as much as possible. If I have reasonable choices, some that are similar to their path and some that are opposite their path. Conversely, if I think I have a better entry, maybe 2 or 3 weeks down the road than an entry in this contest, I may want to just try to cover them with picks, draft with them, right? Stay ahead of, stay with them in the contest until I have the edge. So that's why I like to assess this, because it'll tell me, where am I in relative trouble? Who's my most dangerous competition, and who do I thus want to just try to be off of to try to hope things break my way by being off their path. So that's how I would use this info and kind of assessing how I'm going to play out the pool. Finally, I'm going to dig in to identifying some key picks, both for my entry and for other entries, using this contest as an example. Picks where I might need to think about saving a team, picks where I might have an edge, where the pool may be concentrated, that I might want to save for that spot, and potentially dangerous weeks as well. So, I look through, and this is something you can often find in your pool in like the availability section. A lot of pools will have this, but look at your availability when you're down to the end game, obviously. And so here's this is kind of my ranking of how valuable teams are in the abstract, and then a look at how often they're available in this pool among the 11 entries that remain. So what we see here, there are 4 teams that I would put in the 15 you might want to have in your quiver that nobody has. They all use Detroit, they all use New England, Indianapolis, and Green Bay to get to this point. So those teams are basically dead in this contest, right? They don't matter. Whatever odds happen to them in the next several weeks are not going to have any impact on this pool. The picks that do matter are the other ones. And so I'm going to point out a few things as we look at this particular pool, right? One thing that stands out to me, I want to look at where there are relatively low owned spots. The Rams. David Facillo is the only entry that had the Rams. And if you think back to that board where I showed you the value of entries, which entries had the highest odds at the max CV pass, that entry ranked at the top of the 11 entries. And a big factor there is that it's the sole entry that has the Rams available to them. And so, that's going to be, that's a key point to have in a contest. If you have the Rams, you're going to be in pretty good shape if you're the solo holder of the Rams or any of these other teams at any point in this contest while it's still active. And so what that allows, like where you want to employ the Rams, I mean, if I were him, I want to use a team like that. When I'm the lone holder, I want to find the spot where the pool is going to be relatively concentrated on somebody else, and I have a team with higher win odds. That's the ideal spot. I think that exists. It could be as soon as next week in week 13. If this pool breaks heavily, depending on who survives, which entries get through, and how many of them use, say, the Chargers. Because if half the pool's on the Chargers, I'd want to be on the Rams. That gives me my best spot to kind of benefit from a big upset in a big way. You could save them for 17, But that's one of those spots where, is the contest going to get there, right? Are you going to hold that advantage for too long and it's lessened? Because I think you want to use a pick like this when there are enough entries left that you can get a concentration. And if you're down to head, it's not as big a deal. And that's probably if this contest is still live in week 17, odds are it's pretty limited in how many entries are playing that week. So that's what I would look at. I would look at the Rams. There's a couple entries teams that two people have, right? And they might use them this week, but Baltimore and Seattle. Those entries could choose to use Baltimore and Seattle. Probably will. They do have an edge because if you look at this pool, nobody has Detroit and only 2 each have Baltimore, Seattle, which means that there could be a high concentration on San Francisco. We're going to get to me trying to put this pool on picks, based on running all that optimal pass stuff I talked about, based on trying to analyze these picks. But Baltimore and Seattle right away, and then you have 3 on Buffalo, 3 on Denver. Denver's more of a contrarian choice, but those entries could certainly figure out where they want to employ that. As that's one where I'd want to be the solo picker on a team like that. And then KC is going to come into play for those that have them. Anybody that makes it to week 16 could have an edge there. So I'm looking at that. And then I want to project, I'm going to do this. This is what, if I'm down to the end, I'm doing this. I am running through. I am projecting how people are going to pick, not only this week, but in future weeks, and obviously recalculating each week based on who gets knocked out, how things change. Well, this week in week 12, based on how I see this pool breaking, I guess there's some small chance somebody picks somebody like Jacksonville, but there's not a lot of choices. I think that you're going to see the pickers on Baltimore and Seattle mostly use them. I think you're going to see San Francisco break heavily with the remainder. You might get a Raiders or 2. And so, at those odds, I would love to play a high value team against nearly half the pool on San Francisco. So that's where I would be thinking there. In week 13, we see it a little differently, but we do see still a chance that the Chargers get pretty popular. There are people that have, say, that Rams spot I talked about. Philadelphia, available to a few more entries, but I don't think they're the team that a lot of people are going to flock to across the week 13 slate. Jacksonville. So there could be a lot of alternate options in week 13. So anyway, that's what I try to do. I want to look where I have a relative edge. If I had, say, Philly, and I was pretty good in week 15 otherwise on my path, I may try to play against the Chargers there, right? There's going to be some weeks where you're also looking, you're going, I need to eat the chalk that week because it's the play I need to do to get through to this week. I'm willing to be with a group and risk a, say, massive result that ends in a pot split to get through and have the edge in a future week. So those are things you're going to think about. That's how I like to think about it. I hope this was informative. I check out our tools at Pool Genius. We have all these great tools, the season planner, the optimal path, the EV calculator. That's the other thing I haven't spent a lot of time on, but the EV calculator is another great tool to use. We have an EV calculator. You can run your scenarios. I could put in 11 entries, how I think the picks are going to be dispersed, and check the EVs for my specific pool. And it'll help me make some decisions on where I think there's EV edge. It'll help answer questions, by the way, like, should I be the third picker on San Francisco or the sole picker on Las Vegas? It'll tell you, if you think that's how your pool is going to break, which one's the better option from an EV standpoint. So check all that out at Pool Genius. I hope this was informative on how to think about studying your opponents, finding edges, using that to create bigger payoffs to win your Survivor pools. Good luck. And once again, hit that like and subscribe button. And we want to hear from you about what you like and what you want to hear about in the future. Thank you.